Good day, and thank you for joining Black Agenda Report. I'm Margaret Kimberly. And don't forget to click the like and the subscribe buttons on YouTube. Today, we're joined, I'm happy that Austin Cole is with us. Austin Cole is one of three co-coordinators of the Black Alliance for Peace. The Black Alliance for Peace and other organizations have called on the international community to boycott the 2026 World Cup games scheduled for the United States. The first World Cup matches begin in a few days, and already we're seeing why the U.S. was not an appropriate venue to host the world's most popular sport, football. USians say soccer, and that's just one indication that the U.S. was not the right country to host. Thank you so much for joining me, Austin.
Yeah, thank you, Margaret. It's great to be here as always.
So we have seen we're talking on the 10th of June, first matches in a couple of days. Teams are arriving from all over the world, officials arriving from all over the world, and we are already seeing why the U.S. should not have been the host for the World Cup, and why FIFA should have listened to those voices around the world telling them that the U.S. was not the appropriate venue. Talk to us about some of the things we've seen just in the last 2 or 3 days.
So even, as you mentioned, Margaret, the last couple of days, specifically with regard to FIFA and the World Cup and the tournament, I mean, we've seen the U.S. deny entry to a referee who would have been the first Somali referee to ever, referee a game in the World Cup, and was also the, AFCON, the federation that governs, football on the African continent, was their referee of the year. Right? They interrogated him for 7 hours and then sent him back. Right? Refusing to allow him entry. They've searched down teams from Uzbekistan to Senegal. They've held an Iraqi player for over 7 hours in interrogation. They've denied members of the Iranian delegation and some other delegations entrance into the country. And when it comes to Iran, the U.S. has denied the delegation. They're denied the whole team, right, and the delegation the ability to reside in the U.S. during the tournament, even though all of their games are in the U.S. So they are actually going to have to commute every day that they have a game. They're going to have to get on a plane from Mexico and fly to the U.S. Ostensibly for those games, which obviously folks understand is going to be a huge disadvantage from a sports standpoint, and is just a denial of their human dignity as well. And so all of these pieces that we've seen, all of these things are, when it comes down to it, are smaller than the original, calls that were made to stop the U.S. from hosting, for reasons being their support of and complicity in genocide, right? The wars abroad that the U.S. is executing, as well as the treatment of, both immigrants and citizens here within the U.S., right? Documented or otherwise. And so all of the things that we're seeing recently are just sort of the, some of the small culminations that are related directly to the tournament, on top of the broader context, geopolitical and human context of the U.S.'s terrible treatment of people all throughout the globe.
It's I like most people from this country. I don't know much about football. The football I know is the NFL, American football, but FIFA, the organization that is responsible for hosting the World Cup and all international play, has really abdicated its responsibility. You mentioned the Iranian team having to be in Mexico. There are matches in Canada and Mexico as well. They have to stay in Mexico. And as you said, fly to the US for every game. Apparently, there is a FIFA rule that says every team has to have access to their pitch for 48 hours before they play. So right away, we see how FIFA is has violated its own rules, and so there's a larger issue about the U.S., about how the U.S. controls these organizations, FIFA, the U.S. Olympic Committee, that nations such as Russia, the United States decides Russia can't participate in international sporting events, while the U.S. Is waging a war against Iran and kidnapped the president of Venezuela and is abusing human rights here in the U.S. But the U.S. gets to have control, have too much of a say. We've even seen, and it seemed, and it was very typical of the Trump administration, something that just looked very weird, that FIFA gave Trump a peace prize, which never existed before. He's obsessed with getting peace prizes, which I find odd. But in any case, they did. He asked for it. They gave it to him. And now you've mentioned the Somali referee who was sent home, Iraqi, I believe their team photographer was sent home, the treatment of the Iranians, teams arriving, especially from the global south, being searched as if they're criminals. And their response is just, well, the host country gets to decide these things, which is actually not even true. The host country is supposed to abide by certain rules. But again, we see, I think, a bigger connection with international laws of various kinds, and that the U.S. violates routinely. And every time it gets away with violating something, it violates something else in the future. What are your thoughts about this inordinate influence that the U.S. has?
Yeah, like you, Margaret, with family mostly, in recent generations from the US. I didn't grow up as a huge soccer fanatic, but I have always been a sports fan. Like, I mean, that is what I did basically all day, every day until I turned, 18 and went to college. And so, anyways, and soccer, football, right, has become more a part of that for me as well. And I'll say first off that FIFA, it has always been, at least in its modern iteration, a corrupt institution, right? Even more so than, some of the other international sporting events, or international sporting bodies, which we know are not known for their necessarily morality, right? Including the International Olympic Committee and others. But I think what we've seen over the last few years in the lead up to the World Cup here in the US, and particularly with the Trump administration, is they've taken it to a level that almost goes beyond farce, right? Even the former, FIFA head Sepp Blatter, who had to resign in disgrace, said himself that we should be boycotting these World Cup games because of how ridiculous it is, right? And so for anybody who knows, Sepp Blatter, the history of FIFA, I mean, this guy is literally the face of corruption, right? And he's saying, like, even for me, this is ridiculous. And so we see it, as you already mentioned. It's not just FIFA. It's also the Olympics. It's also, the World Baseball Classic. The U.S. put a lot of pressure under the Cuban delegation, didn't allow Cuban athletes, right, to come and serve in places. They actually put pressure as well under the Puerto Rican delegation, which is ostensibly, quote unquote, part of the U.S., or they consider it in some way. And in the Olympics as well, the Cuban athletes have had a lot of challenges in qualification events leading up to the Olympics in 2028. And so this is a broader view, a broader sort of attack on international sports from the Trump administration that goes beyond the forms of soft power that the US has traditionally utilized in the sporting arena. Because the US has always used sports, right, to push forward its imperialist agenda. But they've typically, particularly since the Soviet Union fell, right, they've typically tried to keep it more under the radar, right, tried to influence in these slight ways and in these small ways. Particularly the Obama administration was huge in doing that and pushing basketball on the African continent to do things like separate Sudan and South Sudan, right? And doing all these other pieces as well, and to influence AFRICOM. But under the Trump administration, like they are doing in other arenas, it's taken on a much more aggressive and militaristic stand, right? Like you said, bolstered by this fake peace prize nonsense, right? The fact that FIFA even decided to give out a peace prize, right? Their first one. And then obviously the way that they are partnering with the US and the Zionist state in Gaza to supposedly say that they're supporting football in Gaza after the Zionist state destroyed not all of the football installations and is also systematically murdering both young and adult footballers from Palestine, from all throughout Palestine right now, right? So all of those things amount to this understanding that, the US is really utilizing what, again, I've said is already a corrupt institution, right? The Qatar Olympics, World Cup, and many previous World Cups showed that, right, in really stark ways, but really, really ramping it up to put a full-on assault on human dignity, any sort of sanctity of international sport that might have remained, right? All of these things they are completely jettisoning at the international stage, and FIFA is a willing participant in that, right? Infantino, the current head of FIFA, has really not only been complicit, but has actually basically been groveling at the feet of Trump in order to, what we can only imagine is, get a lot of funding and basically be on Trump's good side.
Yes, although I don't know how one stays on Trump's good side. Who you never know. But anyway, he thought he was by FIFA, by deciding to allow the U.S. to host, made it clear that's what they wanted. FIFA is going to make a huge amount. You mentioned the corruption. I mean, this, as you said, has been a problem for years. Bribery of officials. FIFA estimates it's going to make $10 billion from this 2026 World Cup. But as you point out, it's not just international corruption. Inevitably, the corruption filters down to the local level. So, for example, here in New York, where I live, games are matches are going to be played at it's MetLife Stadium, where the U.S. football teams, Jets and Giants, play. It's now being renamed New York, New Jersey Stadium. It usually costs $12, I think, or $13 to ride from New York Penn Station to that train station in New Jersey. They originally said that a train ticket was going to cost $150. There was, of course, outcry. Now it's a mere $90 or something along those lines. We're sold on these events as being beneficial to our cities and our states, and New York and New Jersey will make X amount of money. Actually, that's not even clear that that's going to happen. Inflated ticket prices. Only people with money will be able to go. There have been some efforts in New York City. There's been a lottery for tickets, and FIFA has released a few free tickets. But basically, you're talking about people with money to travel, to purchase these inflated ticket prices. So the World Cup and other international events are problematic for that reason too, because they end up following all the dictates of neoliberalism, which are inherently anti-humanity.
Absolutely. And I think that is one of the critical areas of why we say, BAP and then now the Anti-Fascist Football Coalition has called for a boycott of the World Cup, right? Is because precisely of these anti-human methods and structure and systems that have been set up, right? Particularly for the World Cup here in the US, right? Even with all the corruption, all the things that has always plagued, international sports and FIFA and the World Cup in particular, when it came to the actual games themselves, right? And the World Cup and the fans being able to join, there's always been, a lot of work that has gone into people being able to access, right, the games. And so the US is kind of doing the exact opposite, right? And actually even changing the way that the games are going to operate by putting in like a halftime show for the final, putting in basically commercial breaks, which is literally like, I mean, it's ridiculous, right? They are actually changing the sport in order to fit time for commercials when people watch them, right, in the middle of the halves, which totally goes against, the ethos of, watching this sport unfold that happens in a completely different way than, U.S. football or basketball or any of these other things. And so I want to also bring in, as you said, the connection with New York City, and similarly, it's all those economic issues, and it's also the fact that less than 10 miles away there's a hunger strike and a fight against the literal carceral apparatus, carceral and kidnapping apparatus that is ICE, where people are being held at Delaney Hall in ICE detention, less than 10 miles away from MetLife Stadium. Right now, there are protests in New York City, New Jersey is actually hosting a protest and rally there on the day of the first U.S. game, which will be on the 12th, right? This Friday. And so that is, just another stark view of like how this World Cup being hosted in the U.S. represents class and imperialist warfare on the peoples, not only of the U.S., but of the world, right? Because as you said, the people that are attending these games are not just the fans that, are most deeply aligned and really love the game, right? It's the people who can shell out hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of dollars, right? For the tickets, for the transportation, for the hotels, for the visa entry, right? For the flights. And so all of these things are sort of combining to create this, terrible stew of imperialist and class warfare. And here in Philadelphia, actually, where they haven't had the same issues with transportation, they elected not to do price hikes in transportation. They are still, it's been calculated that in the city, between federal and state funding, $9 billion is being invested in this. That is double the yearly budget of the school system here in Philadelphia, after they just closed 17 schools and they're just laying off dozens of workers, right? Dozens of staff in addition to those school closures, right? So they could have funded the schools here for 2 years, right? But they decided to invest those funds in this game and in this spectacle that is not serving the people, right? That is serving Trump and U.S. imperialism's agenda from a cultural standpoint and narrative standpoint, and is representing actual warfare on people's, as we see neighborhoods are also being increasingly surveilled. They are putting in new drone surveillance programs here as well that are almost certainly not going to leave when the World Cup leaves, right? They're using it as a testing ground for all of these, as you said, anti-human activity. And when I think about this, again, as a sports fan, I, grew up mostly in Ohio as a big, Ohio State fan. And one of the points of pride that I had as a young person was learning about Jesse Owens, who went to Ohio State and ran in the 1936 Olympics, right? And ran in Hitler's and Goebbels Olympics in 1936, right? And it basically was a big, fu to the Nazis that this black, person, descendants of slaves, went and ran and won several gold medals. Sort of, in some ways disproving the idea of this Aryan master race, right? But just because those Olympics were also wrought with boycotts, right? People boycotted those Olympics. That was not separate from politics. They did not just go and participate in those Olympics separate from actually protesting the Nazi regime, right? And so when we think about, for folks here, teams like the Haitian national team, the Congolese national team, the Iranian national team, the Senegalese national team, who have already faced, discrimination, harassment, and for many of them, attacks on their countries, occupations of their countries. In the case of Haiti, we are not saying that those teams should not compete, right? We hope that those teams do well, right? We hope that despite all of the discrimination, harassment, and warfare against their peoples, their nations, their national teams, that they succeed in this World Cup, for their peoples, right? And at the same time, we as radicals, as revolutionaries, as African people here in the US, we have to say that these games do not represent any of the things that they claim to, and they do not represent us as peoples of the world and as people who reside in the United States. So we can hold that contradiction right at the same time, in the same way that we can say, as the same way in like the 1968 Olympics, where folks were banned for the political protests that they gave. And we hope people will take the opportunity to make political stands while they are also participating in some of these events as the athletes themselves. But everything that you named, the anti-human activity, we know that both, whether it's the global activities of the U.S., whether it's the broader militaristic and kidnapping activities and other warfare and occupation that the U.S. state is taking on here domestically, or whether it's the actual games themselves, that none of this represents what humanity should actually be trying to build. None of it represents, fraternity, solidarity, humanity, and goodwill between peoples. And so we have to take a stand, and we have to call that out, and we have to really figure out ways creatively that we both, as people either who love sports or people who, love humanity, can really exercise our will and exercise our political principles in this critical global juncture.
I did not know. I have to digress a tiny bit. I had no idea Jesse Owens went to Ohio State. And having Ohio roots myself, I feel like I should have known that. But at any rate, so boycotts, it's, literally a boycott means you don't purchase something or you don't attend a certain event. The games are, are continuing here where they should not be, but that's a reality. So what does it mean to boycott? And I also want to bring up the issue of boycotting the U.S. The U.S. should be treated as an outlaw state. So how do we boycott an event that's going to take place? And how do we raise the issue of the U.S. rightfully being excluded from international events?
Yeah, absolutely. I think and there's many different ways, right, to boycott, and there are, historic boycotts that we draw from, right? The, boycott, divestment, sanction campaign, BDS, with relation to the Zionist state, the boycott of apartheid South Africa, going back, right, in a different, slightly different form, the Montgomery bus boycott and other boycotts of places that were, don't shop where you can't work, right? That African people, Black people here in the U.S. Have a history of building up. And so for us, boycotting means not participating, right, in the World Cup, right? Again, this is not to shame people who may want to watch their team, right, or the athletes themselves who are participating in the games, but it is to say that, from this radical and revolutionary standpoint, not participating, and not only not participating, but actually fighting against the impunity that the U.S. Has basically been afforded in being able to host this game is critical. So that means doing things like, it doesn't mean avoiding anything that says World Cup and just saying, oh, okay, I'm not, I'm going to hide from that, right? But it does mean actually agitating, right, and challenging in those spaces, right? It may mean not watching, the games, or not watching the games hosted in the U.S. or that the U.S. plays in, but it also may mean actually going and where people are watching those things, agitating and informing them about what a boycott means, right? So and as you said, Margaret, it also means thinking about the longer term, right? Because again, the goal is not to, you know, shame people who may watch a game, right? Or who may want to watch a game, or, you know, to go into sports bars and yell and, you know, try to like cut the wires on the TV to stop people from watching the game, right? It is about building broader consciousness, right? While also thinking about, are there ways, you know, to disrupt and to create, you know, a cost for folks um, moving through and just hosting these games as if things are normal, right? And so we can look to, you know, the, as I said before, the 1968 Olympics, where there was a boycott in Mexico, right? Where there was, and other folks globally as well, where, you know, folks like John Carlos and Tommy Smith did, you know, participate in the games, but politically agitated as well, and they were, you know, they were banned afterwards, right? They had their medals stripped for decades, right? And so it looks like encouraging and building relationships with, you know, athletes and others in order to move forward, things like that. Not only now, but also thinking about the longer term in terms of boycotting the U.S. because we understand that the World Cup, while it is this very big global example of, you know, all of these different systems of oppression and structures that are working, you know, as you said, to push forward anti-human activity. It is also just an example of that, right? These things happen on a more daily basis as well, right? Here in Philadelphia, we saw that with the attempt of the Sixers to basically raise Chinatown here and put a stadium here, which, you know, thankfully, at least for now, was denied. But it happens all throughout the country and throughout the world as well. And so it's also about, you know, fighting against this system of, you know, this US oppressive system and structure that is not for us, right? It is not for the mass of the people. It's not for the working class. It is not for African, Black, and other colonized peoples. It is for, you know, the ruling elite and the capitalist class to accumulate, right, and to dominate and to assert their control. So boycotting the U.S. as people who, many of whom live within the borders of the U.S. is not, again, primarily about, you know, it's not about saying that we have to divorce ourselves completely immediately from a system that obviously right now we can't really escape given the current conditions. But it is about building up the ability to do that, right? Building up the ability to have collective self-determination, and also making the call from the international community that we are saying, hey, we are here within the US and we are calling on the international community to boycott the US, right? And some of that has already been happening by, you know, not by choice, because of what the Trump administration has been doing. People have had to find other ways, you know, to get around the US. But we're going to say, you know, if the US is going to continue to commit war crimes all throughout the globe, including just yesterday in Iran, if they're going to continue to strangle Cuba, if they're going to continue to occupy Haiti, to attack, you know, Somalia and Yemen and the Congo, if they're going to be complicit in these genocides, that the international community has to stand up and say no more, right? And we, from within the belly of the beast, are asking for that, right? So it is about us and what we can do, but it's also about making that clear to the rest of the world that this is something that needs to happen, that we need to force the U.S., you know, force the U.S. to, at minimum, make concessions, but, you know, ideally force it into a point where we can actually challenge U.S. imperialism, right? Where we can flex our popular power as peoples. And that for me is, and for us is really the point of, you know, the boycotting and starting with the World Cup and extending more broadly to the U.S. as a whole.
And as we close, how do folks find out about the Black Alliance for Peace and its activities surrounding the World Cup?
Yeah, so people can definitely go on our website, blackallianceforpeace.com, as well as check out on social media, Blacks for Peace on Twitter and Black Alliance for Peace on Instagram. And we also see there the People-Centered North-South Project for People-Centered Human Rights. So people can go to peoplecenteredhumanrights.com and check out more about the specific campaign to boycott the World Cup and boycott the US. And so stay up to date on those things. We're going to be continuously, you know, releasing things all throughout the World Cup, and afterwards. And then for folks who live in one of the cities where we have a citywide alliance, which we have about 10, people should really, can find that information also on our website and on our social media. And then you can tap in locally with some of the efforts that are happening with not only Black Alliance for Peace, but also the Anti-Fascist Football Coalition, which is, a coalition of over 30 organizations that are working all throughout all of the different host cities. So for anyone that is in a host city where the World Cup is happening, look out for those activities and events. Again, you can start by going to the People Centered Human Rights, peoplecenteredhumanrights.com, and looking at the Anti-Fascist Football Coalition, but also look, locally for the activities that will be happening starting tomorrow.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Austin.
Yeah, thank you, Margaret. It's always a pleasure.
And that was Austin Cole of the Black Alliance for Peace, discussing the World Cup matches being held in the U.S. and why the U.S. ought to be boycotted. Thanks again.